So if you meet a friend and, last time you saw them, they were fine. This time they got green ooze coming out with all their orifices, or like the knees on backwards. I think that is wrong. That shouldn't be happening. Something is up with you. Let's get that fixed right now. So you can tell when someone is physically unwell in some shape or form. And you can't do that anywhere nearly as easily with mental health problems.
Hi, I'm Brilliant, your host for this show. I know that I'm incredibly blessed. As the son of self-made billionaires, I've seen the high price some people pay for success, and I've learned that money really can't buy happiness. But I've also had the good fortune to learn directly from many of the world's leading teachers. I created this podcast and the School for Good Living to share what I've learned, and to keep exploring the question, what does it mean to live a good life, and how can we do it? Despite my privilege, I lived for decades in a pretty dark place, and I know that living is often a painful, difficult, and messy business. But I also know that it can be wonderful beyond imagination, and that it's a skill at which we can improve. That's why every episode is a conversation with an author who's an expert regarding spirituality, health, relationships, work, rest, and play, or money. I also ask my guests about their creative habits, routines, and mindsets, and what they've done to get their books written, published, and read. If you're ready to be, do, have, and give more, this podcast is for you. Welcome to the School for Good Living. My guest today is Dean Burnett. Dean's most recent book is a book called Psychological that explores mental health, drawing from nearly 20 years working in the areas of neuroscience, psychology, and psychiatry. He's Dr. Burnett. He's written The Idiot Brain, The Happy Brain. This book, Psychological, which started as an Audible exclusive, is now out in the United States. I wanted to talk to Dean again. He's been a guest on the show before, because I read this book and I learned a lot from it. Mental health is one of the biggest issues facing us as a society today that we understand so poorly, in my view. We talk about what mental health is, how comparisons of mental and physical health are sometimes useful, but also sometimes actually not useful. We talk about social norms, how those are used to determine what is mental health and what is mental illness or mental disorders. We talk about depression. Dean has a very interesting view on what causes depression or contributes to it. He kind of skirts my answer, but I'm grateful for his answer to how can we deal with depression if we find ourselves faced with it. We also talk about self-medicating, and we explore a little bit the biopsychosocial approach to mental health. So you can learn more about Dr. Burnett and his work at deanburnett.com. He's active on Twitter at the handle @GarwBoy, GarWBoy. He's tweeted 122,000 times and has more than 40,000 followers. This book releases February 4th, 2021, about the science behind mental health problems and their treatments. Dean, welcome back to the School for Good Living.
Oh, thank you for having me again, Brilliant. Well, it wasn't brilliant last time, but yes, you know what I mean.
That's right. A lot has changed. A lot has changed. I've changed my name. Your dad has died. The world has gone who knows where. Who knows where it's going.
In any other time, those would be quite profound things, but those are actually just one of many, many things which have happened in 2020, which obviously any listener will have lots of different impacts on their lives as well. So it's a time of change, shall we say, in the most guarded terms possible.
Yeah, that's putting it lightly. Upheaval, sea change, this kind of thing. One of the things that's happened in that span of time that I definitely want to ask you about, I want to start with your dad. And you wrote a blog post or an article where you talked about this, where very early in the pandemic, as we're recording this now, it's December of 2020, but very early you said your dad, who was only 58, so pretty young, in March he got COVID, in April he died.
Yeah, that's basically how it happened. It was out of the blue. They had no prior health problems that we were aware of. He had a gallbladder removed like 6 years earlier. I mean, that's not a chronic problem, is it? Once it's gone, it's gone. He wasn't maybe the healthiest lifestyle, but I've seen people far worse have far less impact from it. It was just out of the blue completely, and it all happened during the early stages of the UK lockdown. So not only did my father fall extremely ill, go to hospital where we couldn't be with him, literally under quarantine, we were not allowed to enter the hospital. he passed away without any of his family around. And that's something which nobody ever wanted. None of us were. I mean, we weren't prepared for it at all, because it happened, I'd say quickly, it's over a period of weeks, but that's still, for someone who was fine a month earlier, that's still a very short space of time. There wasn't like a lingering problem. And yeah, and it was really, really horrific. There's no other word for it. And I had to say goodbye to him. My final words to my father were said over the phone on a WhatsApp call in my kitchen with 20 minutes notice while I was in my pajamas, because they didn't know if he was going to make it through that day. He did, as it turns out, but he was on a ventilator. He was not conscious. That is not how I wanted to do that in any shape. I hadn't planned how I was going to do it. Nobody ever does, I think, but that was not it. But it was either that or nothing. So
I'm sorry to hear that.
So it was a very a very traumatic period, shall we say, and I've gone through some emotional upheaval, to put it mildly. I'm feeling okay now, and if people ask me how I'm doing, I'm doing good. In terms of, I'm functioning. I never got to the point where I couldn't function, but I don't know, in my head, it's obviously had lasting effects on me. I'm wondering, is it because I didn't have any option in the matter? We're in the lockdown. I couldn't have help from anyone. There was nobody around who could feasibly come and help me. We could have broken the rules, but the rules existed to prevent the spread of the virus, which had just claimed the life of my parents. So I was obviously very, very diligent about it. And I got 2 small children. My wife is, I couldn't ask for a better partner in life, but she's one human, and we had a very stressful situation. My kids had just lost their grandparents. They lost all their school friends because they couldn't go near them. So I had to step up and be a dad, which, again, probably was a good thing maybe, but it was a very, very difficult, challenging time. And I got through it, because I had a lot of reserves, which I had to burn through. I found if I had marginally less, maybe I would have crossed that line from mentally well to mentally unwell. It could have easily happened. Didn't, but so far so good. But who knows? Maybe I'm just saving up problems for the future, and day at a time.
I hope that's not the case.
I hope so as well. But it's important to recognize these things.
And one of your earlier books, The Happy Brain, and you mentioned this in an article where you talk about your experience with your dad, is how there were well-meaning people who had good intentions that would tell you things, make you assurances about how it would all turn out, or that he'd be okay, or something like this. And of course, that's not how it turned out. He died.
Yeah, definitely. That was a constant thing. Yeah.
You've introduced me to a new idea, this about toxic positivity. And it wasn't, it's something, looking at it, I realize I've been on both sides of that. I think I've offered it to people at times when it maybe wasn't helpful. And I love the example that you give, by the way, about giving someone a bottle of wine is nice, but giving a bottle of wine to a recovering alcoholic isn't helpful. It's actually unhelpful, right?
Yeah,
but I realize I might be getting ahead of myself in this difference between nice and kind and helpful and things like that. But will you talk a little bit about, and maybe from your own experience or just in general terms, about what is toxic positivity and why does it matter? How can we avoid it, or what should we do if we are offered this toxic positivity?
Of course, yeah. It's actually come up a lot lately. I didn't realize how resonant it was with a lot of people. And I think maybe it's because of the time we're living through, especially now it's Christmas time. Obviously, we have all the usual festivities, like the jolly, colourful lights and the sounds and all the decorations and the excitement, laid over. It's like a veneer over the underlying dreadfulness which a lot of modern life is inflicting on us. So I think, I think people are perhaps more aware of the stark difference between positive intentions and the reality of the situation, which is where a lot of, as I understand it, that's where a lot of toxic positivity comes in. And I think people are sort of pick me up this already, and perhaps I should make it clear that positivity in and of itself is great. It's fine. It's really helpful. Be optimistic, being upbeat, look on the bright side. These are all good things. If anything, the human brain is sort of evolved to do that instinctively, as a matter of course. And we have a load of optimistic biases, a lot of positivity biases. We tend to look on the bright side of things. We tend to think things will go better than they actually, than the odds would suggest. There's a thing called the planning fallacy, where if we plan to do something, we will assume it'll go well, even if we've done it plenty of times before and it didn't go well. Like the obvious example people use is you're planning your trip to the airport, take a flight. Now you think, most people, not everyone, but most people think, well, every time I go to the airport, I look at the map, it's an hour away, So if I leave an hour and a half, it'll be fine. There'll be no traffic. But every time we've done it before, it's taken 2 hours, maybe 2.5. And that sort of doesn't seem to stick in the brain. It always seems to think, yeah, before it was bad, but this time it'll be fine. So we have this tendency to do this anyway. Can be unhelpful, but only in a sort of practical sense.
Dean, what's that called? The fallacy?
The planning fallacy.
The planning fallacy.
Yeah.
So the planning fallacy is that even though we do something repeatedly, we tend to think it will turn out better than it actually does.
Yeah, and I think a lot of sitcom characters and fictional characters do this. Like, this time it'll be different. It's that tendency to say
that trick never works.
I got a good feeling about this one. That sort of vibe. That is what that is. It's the planning fallacy, in that I know, like, my lived experience says that this doesn't work, but I think it will this time. And again,
as we hear the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing
over and over again. But it does seem to be a trait of the human brain by and large. So maybe we're all a little bit insane. But again, I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. So that's the human condition. So positivity is how we operate. When we don't do that, that's when things like depression occur, and that's when these biases are inverted. We cling to the negative. We always assume the worst is going to happen. That's why these things are so debilitating. We need this low-level optimism about life in order to function. Otherwise, we wouldn't do anything, and people with depression can't do much, and that's why it's a problem. But so toxic positivity, and the example you use is probably perhaps a perfect one, is in my father was extremely ill, and it turns out he was going to die. And I got people saying, "I'm sure it'll be fine. It'll be great." And that, I know what you're doing. You are genuinely, you have good intentions. You are trying to make me feel better. You're trying to reassure me that this bad situation will be resolved in a good way. Mm-hmm. But that's not how it works. Like, you don't have that authority to say that. You don't have that any insight to say this is how it's going to happen. But you're acting on your assumptions, your optimistic assumptions. And if I was a less robust person, as it turns out, that could have been devastating for me. As in, people keep telling me, I know some members of my family were doing this, saying, no, he'll be fine. It can't possibly be as bad as the situation suggests, as the evidence suggests. And it was. And that's something which, this denial of reality is where it becomes toxic. And someone's going through a very, very bad time, very hard time, and they are sad about it, or they're angry, or they're depressed about it. But that's a logical reaction to what's happened to them. And when you start telling people, no, your reaction is bad, you should stop doing that, you should be happy, that's when it becomes problematic. That's when you have people it has so many consequences which are unhelpful. So first off, you're saying, your reaction is wrong, even when it's not, so you should change it. So forcing someone to sort of suppress their instinctive emotions and try and express a different one, that's not how the brain works. That's actually quite unhelpful. It can be quite disruptive, and it causes stress and mental health consequences down the line for the brain to constantly do that. It happens a lot in the workplace. Yeah.
And to compound, right? Then feeling guilty or some other disempowering emotion about, well, why can't I just choose to be happy? There must be something wrong with me. And then it's this kind of squirrel cage.
Yeah. That's another part of it, isn't it? If someone is going through a hard time and feels depressed or sad about it, again, that's a very logical reaction. But a lot of the time the circumstances are beyond their control. In that, like me, my father is deathly ill. It's awful, but that's not my fault. I'm not responsible for that. It's purely just horrifically bad luck. But if someone said to me, like, you're upset, you can choose to be happy. These inspirational mantras, you can choose your attitude. You can opt to be a cheerful person, and that sort of it's not how the brain works. But also it imparts the blame or the responsibility on the person themselves. Like, if you're upset, if you're sad, that's your choice. So therefore, you've made the wrong choice, and therefore you can make the right choice, but you're not doing so. So all this is on you. So not only are you upset and stressed about the situation, you also got people telling you, the way you're feeling is your responsibility. So you need to, buck your ideas up. You need to pull your socks up and do some actual work and improve in this, which just compounds the problem. And like you say, it becomes it exacerbates things rather dramatically. And that's another reason why it can become toxic, because you get caught in this spiral.
Yeah. And your most recent book, Psychological, that I believe began as an Audible. book that you're now preparing for release, or maybe by the time people hear this will be released in the States.
I think the state thing is on. It's under negotiation. It's already an audio book, which you can get from Audible, I think, internationally.
Yeah.
It was published last October, so it's over a year old technically. But since then, obviously, I've gone through all this. We've all gone through a pandemic, so I've updated it somewhat for the print release, because obviously you can't really have. Well, I don't think you can have a mental health book out now saying which ignores the pandemic, which is such a massive factor in people's well-being these days. So so it's been updated for the print. Yeah.
So you gave me a copy of this, and I was able to read it. Thank you for that.
No
I got a lot out of this book, and I'm really glad you've written it. It's a massive subject, right? But again, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Will you tell me, please, why did you write this book? Who did you write it for, and what do you want it to do for them, or how do you want the world to be different?
Thank you.
Because of this book.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I'd like to talk about if anyone asks me, and you're the first person, so thank you very much. It's well, the circumstances around how it came to be are sort of more quirky than mundane than anything particularly profound, in that I was writing a different book about emotions for my usual publisher's Faber, that was meant to be out this year, and it isn't out yet because the subject it was going to be about how emotions work in the brain. Now it's just like a rundown of, which I think people are interested in, because I did my previous book, The Happy Brain. One of the common questions I got was, why did you write about happiness, why not any other emotion? Which I guess people are just being curious, but it felt a bit insulting, a bit as in, why did you write this? Why did you write a different book? Well, fine now. The hell with you then. I don't know. I don't know. You're not the boss of me. That sort of thing. But but it was, again, it didn't mean that, but it's sort of like, oh, I spent a lot of time on this. Thanks a lot. And so I thought, well, people seem to be interested in other emotions, so I'll do them all. I'll do a book where it explains how every emotion works in the brain. And unfortunately, I sort of agreed to do this book, and I pitched it. They said, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do that. Next book. And I thought the science was far more established than it really is.
About emotion.
It turns out emotions are one of the most confusing, confounding, knotty, thorny, vague, and nebulous subjects in neuroscience.
Oh, yeah. By the way, like when I hear you say that you were going to write a book about emotion, to explain emotion, immediately I thought of that story of the little girl drawing the picture of God.
Okay. It's pretty much exactly that. As in, first thing I did, I'll start the book with a definition of emotions. Oh, there isn't one. Oh, that's a big subject of debate, and then it just it went downhill from there. Like, oh, I don't know anything about this. This is a whole.
So you're working on this book about emotion, and then for some reason you detour to create this book of psychological.
Yeah. So this book about emotion, which now has been completely overhauled because now I have gone through an immensely emotional experience, so I have a personal take on it now. So that'll be out in 2022, assuming I get it done when I promised you now. So at this time, I'm sort of like thinking, right, I need to start this book again and again and again, and I get approached by Audible, the UK branch of the audiobook company, and they say, my first book, The Idiot Brain, has been a big hit for them. I think it's one of those books which translates really well into audio format because it's like easily digestible sections. It's all stuff people want to hear about. So they like to work with me. They like to do some more stuff with me, and they were moving into original products like Netflix did eventually when they started making their own program, and that was obviously a very big success for them. So they said, well, what do you want to do something about? And I had always wanted to write a book about mental health because I never planned to be a mental health writer. That was not actually on my agenda at all. If I'm being honest, I never planned to be a writer at all. I didn't think anyone would want to hear anything I had to say. Because
just to jump in for a moment and maybe give a little context the listener might not be aware of is that your background is not as a clinical or a counselor, but instead as a researcher and an academic, right? In neuro, I'm a neuroscientist. Neurological, neuroscientist.
Yeah, both my undergraduate and my postgraduate degrees were in was it minor and major? They call them. I don't know what the different terms, but they were straight neuroscience. I'm not a clinical practitioner. I have no authority or no license to diagnose people or prescribe treatments or anything like that. I'm very much the theory guy. I'm the guy sort of in the background, work in the labs, produce the information which goes on downstream to clinical professionals to use and exploit as people need. which is fine, of course. It's all on paper. It's all the theory, the underlying science of it all, which is obviously a big part of clinical applications and psychiatry or anything you want to talk about in that regard. So again, I didn't think I was. It's not that I didn't think that was stopping me from doing a book, but also I was a neuroscientist, but I wasn't even a particularly good one of those. I was like very much a run-of-the-mill neuroscientist. I wasn't the most driven, passionate researcher, because people, I think it's the same in the States, in that in the UK at least, grants, scientific research grants are very much dog eat dog. You've got to get as many as you can. Publish or perish. It's a very, very competitive field, and the ones who succeed are the ones who live and breathe the work. And I've always had far too many other interests to be that focused. And I'm also not from an academic background family-wise, so when I entered the field, I came at it sort of a very, very cold start. I had to learn during the ropes as I went along, which other people didn't. So I was always at a bit of a loss. So I assumed I'd just chug along the background of neuroscience for ages, but and then make a career of that, just getting by. But also, my family are strong performers. The Burnett family are very enthusiastic about the stage. So I ended up doing plays and pantos and improv stuff, and then started doing some comedy. But I always liked writing about that stuff more than actually doing it. I'd write a comedy set. He goes, "Oh, that's a great set. Oh, I've got to tell someone it now." That felt boring, so I didn't like. That's the dull part. I want to just write some more stuff. So. And I got into writing there via blogs and sort of doing funny science things, and ended up writing for the Guardian website, the UK newspaper, The Guardian. And it sort of snowballed from there. I had a knack for writing about scientific things, and then an agent got in touch and said, "Do you ever thought of writing a book?" And like I say, I had, but in terms of, in the same breath as, be nice to own a jetpack, be nice to go to Mars. Yeah. These are all pipe dreams that are never going to happen. It's just an idle daydream, but it did happen. So, but the reason I got, roundabout way of trying to tell you this, the reason I actually got sort of noticed and sort of respected as someone who can write books and about the mental health area, and it's a very bittersweet thing for me, in that the reason I get to do this now is because Robin Williams died in the way he did. And that sounds weird, but what happened was I went into work on the 9 o'clock in the morning on August I don't know, I can't remember the date it was, but 2014, Robin Williams took his own life by suicide, and the news broke that night, obviously in the States. And when I went in the morning, I just checked the websites and oh my God, Robin Williams has passed away, and that was just horrific. And obviously all the news about it, because it was such an unexpected, and he's such a widely loved figure and larger than life, and he's such a big part of everyone's life. It's Robin Williams. He's just everywhere. He's that guy, and I sat down at 9 o'clock and I was looking through just the feeds and the news, and already you were seeing the usual punditry, the usual sort of knee-jerk, oh, it's selfish what he's done. He's just selfish for doing this. It's causing pain. He is a selfish man for taking his life in this way. And at the time I was working as a psychiatry lecturer and a tutor in the psychiatry field, teaching doctors how to do psychiatry and all the different ramifications and manifestations of mental health problems. So I knew that was not how it works. It's not a selfish thing. If anything, people with depression who take their own lives, and I know since then we found out he had Lewy body dementia, which is a whole other thing, and it's also horrific, but it comes with depression as well. So, at the time everyone assumed it was because of depression. And I know depression doesn't work that way. When someone with depression opts to end their own life, they're not doing it for selfish reasons. They think they're doing the world a favour because they think they are so worthless, so devoid of any value, and such a burden on everyone. They sort of, it's an act of sacrifice on their part, or not even self-sacrifice. It's like them saying, I am going to rid the world of my presence because I'm so bad. And that's, so to get to that mindset is so incredible to think that, overruling millions of years of survival instinct deeply embedded in our psyche and making that decision shows both how powerful our brains is and how wrong they can go. So I thought, this happens every time someone high profile takes their own life, which is a depressingly common occurrence. And I wanted to say, well, no one in the media ever sort of fights back against that. So I'm thinking, I wish someone would. And I realised, I have a Guardian blog, nothing major, just a regular sort of little corner of the website. Well, I'll do it. I'll say it. I'll explain exactly why this is wrong. And I know no one's going to read it because it's it's the day of the news breaking. There's going to be far too many big names and commentaries and obituaries, which are going to. But I felt like I had to do something. So I just did like a 90-minute thing about that's not how depression works. This is how it works. That's why the selfish claim is wrong. Put it on the website. I thought no more of it. And so like 2 days later, it'd been read like 3 million times. And apparently I didn't realise so many people felt the same. And that it was something which people wanted someone to say all this time. And I'd said it finally. And then it became a really, really big hit. Still gets referenced today and stuff. And my understanding has evolved since then. But that was like across the line from sort of the jester of the science section to, oh, this guy actually writes stuff, proper stuff. And since then, I became like the mental health guy for a lot of people. Like if you want someone to explain about mental health, it was me who did it in a sort of compassionate way and in a respectful way if anyone has the issues, even though I've never had it myself. So I became that guy for a while. And I thought, well, for a lot of people, that's who I am. That's my audience. But I put it in my other books, like the Idiot Brain's in there, Happy Brain's in there, like mention of depression and stuff. But I wanted to write to me about mental health, solely about mental health, because I felt like, well, my insight is different to most mental health books. And that was the problem. My agent said that you could do that, but people have tried to do a scientific mental health book before. And the problem, not sort of problem, but what publishers seem to, the basic understanding is that with a mental health book, it's got to be from the perspective of someone who has gone through their own mental health issues and come out the other side, or is still handling them. It's got to be a personal journey. It's got to be a narrative. It's got to be almost like a mental health diary, because people don't want dry, dull facts about mental health. They don't want to be lectured. And I totally get that. I think the patient should come first when it comes to mental health problems. There's been a lot of issues in the medical field with the whole medical model approach, where you tell a patient, this is what's wrong with you, take these medications, do this thing, and then you will be better. Go away and don't bother me for a month. That's not an approach which works at all with mental health issues in many cases. So I get that, but I think with all the mental health campaigns, the efforts to raise awareness, as someone who does a lot of neuroscience and psychology, I know that awareness is great, but it's not the be-all and end-all. It's basically the start of the journey. And awareness is fine, but a lot of mental health awareness campaigns sort of boil down to a very simple message of depression is real, pass it on. That's fine, but that's not how people work. That's not how you convince people. And I thought if you introduce more of the scientific aspect of it, if you explain why the brain does this and then we have depression, or the brain does this and we have anxiety, that can be a far more effective tool. It grounds it. It gives it a tangible presence, especially with the brain, which is a physical thing. People might not know how the mind works. I mean, nobody knows really, but the average person doesn't know how the mind operates. They don't know, they think in terms of spirituality perhaps, but they know the brain is a physical thing at least. So if you can say, yes, depression is real because this part of the brain changes like this, and there's less neuroplasticity here, and the transmitters are down, whatever the explanation is, I felt like that would be more persuasive to give people give it a ground-in effect, make it something they can grasp. They can hold in their head this idea of, oh, so because these brain cells are doing this now, then we have these outcomes. And I thought a book like that would be useful, or like a series of articles or whatever. And but I say, because I wasn't someone who went through it myself, it was always like, be a bit of a risk to do that. And then Audible came along and said they wanted to do something with me. And I said, well, I wanted to do something like this for a while. And they said, oh, that sounds great, especially because in the audiobook setting, there's still a big stigma around mental health stuff. So people read books and all the time in public, sitting in a cafe, on a commute or something. And if you've got a book which says, like, this is how mental health problems occur, people find there's still a lot of stigma about that. Being open about your mental health things, people don't want to do that. But if you're listening to an audiobook, it becomes, it's completely anonymous. No one knows what you're listening to. It could be a podcast, could be this, which is fine as well. Like I wouldn't mind declaring that, but it could be anything. So an audiobook was sort of like a nice, safe way of getting it out there for anyone who's interested. And enough interest occurred, and people now are, the publishers actually said, okay, well, that seems to have gone down well. Let's turn it into a print book. And here we are, which is possibly the longest-winded answer to a question you've ever had. But here it is. That's the situation.
Thank you for laying that out. This was almost half a lifetime ago, but I spent myself about 3 weeks as a patient in a psychiatric ward. And I was diagnosed as bipolar, and I was prescribed medications. I gained 100 pounds. There were days where I couldn't get out of bed. I didn't know who I was. I couldn't read or comprehend a page of text. I mean, it was, there's almost no words. Like I'd resort to poetry to attempt to describe it, you know?
Chemical boy. Yeah, exactly. And it's not something which is, it's not a dry factual experience. You can't really.
Yeah. And it was interesting. I mean, I learned a lot about myself and other people and, you know, things like this. And yet it's not something I talk much about, you know? So I'm grateful that you're writing this book and you say in the book a few times about, I wish we had a better way of talking about this or shared language or things like that. And when I said I learned a lot from your book, or I thought about things, I think, in ways I never had before, one of them was this, which is mental health, because you distinguish a bit between mental health, mental illness, mental disorder, and the language we use matters a lot to the way we feel, the way we understand this kind of thing. What is mental health?
It's one of those things which, like, everyone is, obviously, like emotions, I suppose, everyone sort of knows what it is. But if you ask someone to explain it in words, like, I just know. Like, it's not something you can actually articulate effectively. And for the sake of the book, my argument was that mental health is, again, drawing a comparison with physical health, like your bodily health, which I know I get into in the book as well, whether those comparisons are fair or not. But in the more general terms, if we take physical health to mean the overall performance and standard of operation of your body, all your organs, all your bones, all your tissues and muscles, working together as a sort of gestalt whole, and the standard at which they operate in. So take, like, all my organs and bones are working like this. So the total performance of my body is this. That's my health. And I think that's why you can have, like, your whole body doesn't have to go wrong to have poor health. It can just be a liver disorder, a kidney disorder, like a broken bone. You are then technically in bad health because the sum is compromised. Yeah. And mental health is the same thing, but with your mind, your mental capacities, like your emotions, your thoughts, your feelings, your moods, your beliefs, your attitudes, your creative side, your imagination, your senses, your perception, your articulation,
your memories.
All these memories, of course, yes. I've got a PhD in memory. Weird thing to forget. Ironic in every single level. but yeah, so, like, all these things operate together, and, like, the sum total of them is your mind. And if they're operating in a functional way, they're not actually causing any disruption, then you are in good mental health. If any one of those things, and it's not normally just one, it's causing problems and limiting your ability to function, then you're in poor mental health. You have a disorder or mental illness, depending on what term you prefer to use. So yeah, so mental health is like the sum total of all the aspects of your mind working in concert, and whether or not they are functioning in what we would deem to be a normal and acceptable way.
That's, I think, a great way of understanding it. And you touched on this briefly, but I want to explore it with you a bit now, which is when people, they do relate mental health to physical health. Sometimes that's useful, but sometimes it's actually not useful. Will you talk a little bit about that?
Of course, yeah. And you see it a lot now, especially with the expansion in mental health awareness campaigns and drives, and social media has obviously been a big part of propagating these things. And you see a lot of memes and posts and inspirational things. So I think the classic one is, if we talked about mental health problems like we talk about physical ones. Physical ones like we talk about mental health ones. So someone with a broken leg, it's like, have you just thought about going for a run? Get outside a bit. Or someone with a malignant tumour. So you need to have a more positive attitude. And yes, when you put it like that, it is ridiculous to say you have a serious health problem. Have you thought about just ignoring it, or back to the toxic positivity thing, changing your belief and things?
And on that note, by the way, just to jump in, I hope I don't mess your flow, but you talk about telling somebody with mental health issues it's all in their head is like telling somebody with arthritis, oh, it's all in your joints.
Yeah,
it's like not helpful.
Yeah, correct, but also I don't think you're saying what you think you're saying. As in, like, that doesn't mean it's not a thing. And it's also just important to point out, like, the whole thing of comparing mental health to physical health problems, it does suggest that there's a sort of compartmentalization. You can have one or the other, but that's not the case at all. They overlap considerably. You can have, like, something like depression from a terminal diagnosis. So if you have like a cancer diagnosis, you will very likely to have depression at some point, because you've got a terminal cancer diagnosis. Why wouldn't you? What could be more traumatic than that? And when you have like something like depression first or anxiety, the chemicals your brain puts out and the influence it has of your body is quite profound and marks. You have a lot of physical symptoms from mental health problems. So like the brain and body aren't two separate entities. I think I mentioned my analogies. They're not like neighbours nodding to each other over the fence. They are the same thing with two heads, or they're far more intertwined than that. So it's important to recognise that as well. There's a great deal of comorbidity between mental and physical health problems. But I think when it becomes an issue, it's fine to do. My argument is that when you're encountering someone who has a very naive, or perhaps I say complete ignorance of mental health problems in general, so someone doesn't even think mental health problems are a thing, and people like this still exist. They are becoming less and less common, thankfully, but they're still out there in different cultures and different communities. You'll find people who just can't quite conceive of the idea that mental health could even be a problem. And so to compare a mental health problem to a physical one is a useful tool there to say, yes, mental health can go wrong because it's like physical health. Because even if someone doesn't accept that mental health problems are a thing, it's pretty much guaranteed they will have had a physical ailment or physical health problem at some point in their lives. They know this. They have had a upset stomach or a headache or a damaged bone or just an injury of some sort, because it's really impossible to avoid these things in your life. Your body, human body is a complex thing, and it goes wrong quite often in mundane, minor ways, but still, you recognise this shouldn't be happening. I've got a toothache, I've got a earache, I've got a headache. Something about my body is going wrong. So it's a very easy concept to grasp. So to say it's like when your body goes wrong, this time it's your mind going wrong. You've got this mood which you can't change. You've got this anxiety which you can't change. It's a useful parallel to draw a comparison to, and perhaps it's almost like the equivalent of when people say the brain is like a computer, which neuroscientists by and large don't like that much, because the human brain is very, very much not like your average computer in many, many ways. It operates completely differently, it manipulates information in different ways, it's totally different operating system, for want of a better description. But having said that, what is there in the modern world which people can recognise as something which does many things and manipulates information and stores memories? And so it's like, yes, it's a bad example, but it's better than all the others that we can possibly have. So there are good reasons to say mental health and physical health problems are kind of the same. Where that becomes a problem is when you start expecting mental health problems to be like physical health problems in how they are dealt with and how they operate and how they manifest and how they pan out, because they have some very marked differences. Mm-hmm. And when we have a physical problem, we expect it to be fixed or be fixable, at least. Now, a lot aren't, but that's generally how it works in people's expectations. I have this physical problem. It's a disease, it's a rash, it's a fracture. I will go to the doctors. They will do XYZ medical intervention. I will, I might have to convalesce, but I will get better and I will get back to normal. My body will return to its normal state. And that's what people expect from physical health problems. Not all of them like that. You have things like diabetes, which are chronic, and issues like that, and unknown illnesses. But by and large, I'd say that's how people think physical health problems go. You go to the doctor to get it fixed, get it cured. Yeah. And mental health problems, by and large, don't work like that. We don't have an obvious physical source which you can point to and say that's where the problem is. The brain is far more flexible and far more complex and far more nuanced than that. And you can have a mental health problem when your brain is operating fine. There's nothing tangibly wrong with your brain. It's just doing unhelpful things because the experiences you've had have caused it to do that. It's like a computer with. Back to the computer example. I know I said I shouldn't do that, but again, what else is there? It's like a computer has been given a virus. As in, this computer is doing really unhelpful, disruptive things, but you don't then go and start poking the motherboard because the motherboard's fine. There's nothing wrong with the hardware. It's the software which is a problem, and that's a lot of time where mental health problems come from. Is in your brain has learned to do this thing, or it's adapted to something in an unhelpful manner. So you can't really. We don't have the technology or the ability to go in and say this is what's causing your mental health problem. Let's just tweak this and change that and stuff. And And that's, but when people expect that, so you get a lot of, the workplace is a good example. People have time off with mental health problems. To become more of a common thing, you can do that, which is good, that's progress, but then you still have all these systems in place to, for time off work or for sick leave, which are pretty much entirely based on physical problems. Like, how long have you had your illness? When did you first fall ill? What have you done to cure it? Like, when do you expect to be back? And you don't know any of these things with a mental health problem. And I put a time frame on it. Like, hey, you can have 2 weeks sick leave. Now, if you've got a severe cold or the flu, that makes sense. Or if you're having an operation, you need to convalesce. Fair enough. But you don't know how long a depressive episode is going to last. You don't know how long your anxiety is going to be a problem. Like, the anxiety's got to be present for 6 months before it gets diagnosed. So, we expect. I think we people generally assume that health problems equals physical health problems, and while that's understandable, like, mental health ones need to be approached differently and in different ways, and to constantly say they are the same is sort of overlooking that, and that can lead to more problems down the line.
Yeah. In addition to those challenges that you mentioned, and you addressed this a little bit earlier, but about the stigma that's also present with this, and a general, I guess there's probably a combination of a ignorance and misunderstanding. There's things we just don't know. There's things we think we know that we probably misunderstand. Totally, yeah. And one of the examples that I really just found myself going, holy cow, that you include in the book is about homosexuality. That 50 years ago, right? Well, you as recently as 50 years ago, we considered that a mental illness by the clinical definition, right?
Totally, yeah. It's weird to think we've gone from that to same-sex marriage is largely legalized in developed countries now, and like that's quite a turnaround. It's something to be proud of, but it's also something. It's a dark thing to think of. As little as 5 decades ago, we were saying people who are homosexual were mentally unwell just because of their sexuality, which we know isn't like scientific. There are plenty of people who still think that. Let's not deny that. There are plenty of people who will happily accept that people who are gay are abnormal or wrong in some way, but that's a personal ideological thing. That's not a scientific thing anymore. But it was, right. And that's profound, and that's quite alarming when you think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and what that points to, again, about the ignorance or the misunderstanding and things, I often think about the diagnosis of ADHD, which I believe was in 1978 that was introduced.
I think so. It was ADD then. It's ADHD.
ADD,
recently.
Or in World War II, before PTSD, shell shock.
Yeah.
These kinds of things that we didn't even have language for, let alone an understanding of. And it can, in the same way that these examples, point to the fact that our understanding, hopefully, continues to grow and be refined, along with our understanding of the neurochemistry and the operation, what's going on in the body and at the organic level, but this kind of thing. But what's your view about how much of what mental health is being basically an agreement, or established on societal norms? How does that factor into all this?
Yeah, and that's a big part of it. That's one thing I really wanted to emphasize in the book, in that these things change. Like, back to the physical illness is also more easily understood because the human body is consistent. So if you have a rapid heartbeat now, that's the same rapid heartbeat like a Roman soldier would have had if he'd had one. Or if you break a bone now, like your ancient Greek ancestor broke the same bone, they would have felt the same thing. Because we know what the human body looks like, how it operates. And it has done like that for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years now. So if you meet a friend and last time you saw them they were fine, this time they got green ooze coming out of all their orifices, or like the knees on backwards. I think that is wrong. That shouldn't be happening. Something is up with you. Let's get that fixed right now. So you can tell when someone is physically unwell in some shape or form, and you can't do that anywhere nearly as easily with mental health problems. So, like, same friend, if you saw them last time, they were cheerful. This time they're not. They're really unhappy. You think, oh, they must have depression. Like, maybe they do, but maybe they've just maybe like a day ago their partner broke up with them. Maybe their father had just died, like I've been through, and maybe they just lost their job. Maybe they're just worried about something they saw on the news. You can't really say. It looks the same to the outside observer.
Yeah.
So, and because like the mind is so much more flexible, so much more intangible than the body, the idea of what a normal mind does, it's far more influenced by social norms or cultural norms than than physical issues. And that's a big issue because social norms change. Social norms adapt and they evolve over time. Back to your example you brought up, homosexuality was considered socially abnormal. Now it's far more accepted, so it's not a problem anymore. It's not recognised as such. But at the time, it met all the criteria. Like it's maladaptive because people who are gay are actually, they tend to have a lot more stress, a lot more hassle, a lot harder lives. So you wouldn't be gay because that means you have a harder life. But then that's it's a choice at all, and then also it's biologically maladaptive, and that means you can't reproduce. That's what sex is for, isn't it? And these are very old-fashioned ideas of how people should and shouldn't behave. Meant that homosexuality was classed as a disorder. But society has evolved since then, which is great. We no longer think that's the case. But it begs the question: what are we doing now? That people 100 years time thinking, can you believe them? They thought that was a problem, and hopefully it won't be nearly as bad as that, but maybe it will. We don't know, and that's because social norms are all constantly evolving, constantly changing, and even like legal things. So I think one thing I mentioned is that until relatively recently, one of the criteria for addiction was that addicts would engage in illegal acts, illegal behaviours, because obviously when you're a drug addict, you need your drug of choice so much that you will break the law to get it. It shows like you're motivated to get that more than observing social laws, which makes a certain amount of sense. But then laws change, things get legalized. So like an example I use, like if someone is like, someone could have a diagnosis of mild addiction if they smoke loads of marijuana and sort of keep buying it, which is an illegal act. That's two strikes on the mild addiction stage. Like I say, they smoke more than they plan to, and they break the law to get it. Right? They're an addict, and the next day, like a law is passed. Now marijuana is legal. Now they've only got one criteria. So currently, now they're not mentally unwell according to the criteria. So therefore, but they haven't changed. They've done nothing different. Now yesterday they were an addict, and now they're not. Yeah. And that's why you shouldn't really have like diagnosis based on laws, because laws change, laws shift over time, laws can be updated and adapted and repealed. I think example I use, it's like basing a diagnosis on a legal matter is like sort of mooring your boat to mooring your boat by tying it to a cow. It's a big, sturdy, heavy thing, but it could just wander off. And then you don't know where your boat is, and then you're completely lost and what's going on. So yeah, it's like social norms, what we expect and what we deem to be normal. These things change and alter and ebb and flow, and that's something has to be acknowledged if you want to. That's why diagnoses are constantly being updated and constantly being refreshed. And like, okay, so 20 years ago we thought this was an issue. Apparently everyone disagrees. So if you do this now, you're not abnormal. You're actually a normal person. So yeah, and that's something which I think really needs to be emphasised. And that yes, sometimes it's clear cut. And I'm not saying like there's no such thing as mental. Although there are people who say that there's no such thing as mental health problem. It's just societal problems which don't recognise these things. And I'm not in that camp, because people with mental health problems can be severely compromised. They want help. They think, I can't operate, please help me. And you can't just turn around and say, oh, you're fine, it's society which is a problem. It's like, well, can I still have some sort of help, please?
Yeah. Anyone who has had a schizophrenic family member.
Well, precisely, yeah. And you know how it can be quite... so that's a very lofty approach. And
we're constantly, as we've explored, as a society and as individuals, we're constantly learning and hopefully adapting and updating our understanding. But one of the things that I thought was interesting in your book is about your discussion about depression. Mm-hmm. And for me, I thought of this a little bit like mindfulness and meditation, where they're not the same thing. They're often, conflated or thought of as the same thing. But in this same way, like depression is like mental health does not only deal with depression, of course, but it's such a big issue in the world these days. I mean, why? I want to explore that. Like, why on earth why does depression affect so many of us? And what are the limits of the way we're talking about it now. So maybe even this, if you'd be willing to start, because you quote some statistics about how prevalent depression is, at least in the UK, and I think they're probably reflective of in the United States as well.
Yeah, it's a weird one, and that's, to go from, it wasn't that long ago. I think I started writing about this sort of thing maybe in 2005, something like that, or 2006. And even then, you were seeing regular punditry or regular online and newspaper articles, and from the let's call them the attention seekers, the rabble-rousers, saying things like depression isn't real, it's not a thing, it's just made up for people who want attention or people who can't handle the real world. These very offensive, very upsetting and needlessly combative approaches. But they were reasonably common. They're on their way out when I started, but they were still there. And these days now you'll get more... I think the default argument with depression is that antidepressants aren't a thing. They don't do anything. They're just a scam by Big Pharma and so on, which, again, that's a whole other issue, and it's not a helpful one by any means. But it does show at least some signs of progress. At least now people widely accept that depression is a real thing. So, but again, it's hard to deny the evidence, because it's the most common mental health problem the world over, as far as the data shows. And a lot of them... If you go by the measurement of years dealing with disability measurement, it's the second biggest problem the world is facing in terms of how much poor health can impact on societies and economies and cultures. That the most common issue, the most prevalent and most problematic issue is, oddly, lower back pain, because this measurement is a combination of how common something is and how debilitating it is, because depression is very common and very debilitating, but lower back pain is extremely common, and it can happen after a particularly aggressive sneeze, and that's. But it completely wipes you out. It lays you low for God knows how long. If you've got lower back pain, seriously, you can't do anything. You can't even move. Whereas someone with depression can still do that. So depression is a really big and common problem. And as to the whys, again, that's a whole thing which is still being unpicked and still being assessed. But according to the current evidence, a lot of it's to do with stress. That goes for many mental health problems, particularly the neurotic ones like anxiety, depression, and the related disorders of mood and temperament and things like that. Because we do live in a stressful world, and I know there are plenty of people who will say, now, we in the developed world at least live a more comfortable life than any of our ancestors, and that's true in terms of physical needs and physical dangers and physical requirements. Like, we have abundant access to food. We have, the streets are safe from wolves. I'm not been to many cities in America, but I'm assuming wolves aren't a problem by and large. I know raccoons, perhaps.
At least not in my town.
Yeah, I know raccoons are a thing, but they seem fairly harmless in terms of what they do to us. So, the problems we face in the wild are gone now. We have completely changed our environment in that regard. And even things like disease. And I know in time of a pandemic, that's a weird thing to say, but by and large, medical advances have been like common diseases like strep throat and malaria and things like that, or smallpox or cholera. These are all things which we've not vanquished, but we've got them under control. So we have a much better prospect and a much more comfortable life than any of our ancestors could have had. But that's not how it works. That's how the brain doesn't think that. It doesn't think, well, I live in a developed society. I live in a modern city. Ergo, I am safer than my ancestors, so I am happy. That's not... No, our brain, what you're exposed to from day one is your default. Like, well, I live in the city, so city life is my default norm. That's my baseline. I've never lived in the African savannah. I don't know how that works. I have no experience regarding that. So things can be stressful. Even if you have a very pampered life by anyone else's definition, that's your baseline. So when things go wrong, as they inevitably will, because that's life, it causes you stress. And that's a problem. And one of the main reasons stress is such a problem is because, if anything, the human brain has become a victim of its own success. In that stress is like a precursor to the fight or flight or freeze response, the classic fear response. When I'm in danger, I'm in mortal danger, I need to run or fight or do something to save my own skin. And that's a deeply evolved, deeply instinctive, very, very powerful mechanism in every brain, really, not just the human one. But for most creatures, more simpler creatures, in the cognitive sense, it's, the danger has to be present and tangible. Like, there is a predator right there. There's looming shadow. I can hear something come in. I can smell decay. These are physical things which they react to, and then they sort of run away or deal with it, and then it's gone. So no, the stress response is there, then it's gone away again because whatever the problem was is dealt with, or it's killed you, and that's either way it's gone. The stress problem. So that's how most creatures operate. But the human brain is actually expanded in terms of complexity and cognitive abilities to the point where we can actually envisage intangible dangers and threats, and things aren't necessarily a physical danger, but just a danger to our status, a danger to our situation. So we can think, oh, the economy's not going great. I might lose my job if my company has to downsize. And that causes you stress. It's a thing which hasn't happened, which may never happen, or it doesn't have any sort of physical risk to you, but we experience stress anyway. And like public speaking, another one. Like humans are extremely social beings. The idea of being judged by someone when you're trying to do something in front of them, like in a public speaking or singing or performing way, I find them having them judge you negatively. That terrifies a lot of people because we are such social creatures. Like pack membership, part of the community, is literally a matter of life or death for us from our evolving in tribes. And so we think, well, if people reject me, I will be so embarrassed. I'm just I'll be mortified. But we have a serious stress reaction to that possibility, even though there's no risk to us. It's not going to harm us unless you do really, really badly at a gig or something. But no one's going to actually physically attack you. But this still causes the same stress response because we have the deeply embedded flight or fight response, the threat detection mechanism, which reacts to physical dangers, but also it reacts to anything our brains find worrying or distracting or just negative. I don't want that to happen. And it causes the same response, and it causes a stress response. But one problem is, like, it seems to be that the human brain hasn't evolved. These complex cognitive abilities evolved very quickly over the last 2 million years, which is really rapid in evolutionary terms. But the underlying mechanisms of threat and fear and stress are still the same. They respond the same way. But we haven't evolved they haven't evolved to deal with chronic stress. Like, most stress is acute, as I call it in science, but it's fleeting. It's intense. I'm being attacked by something. I'm in danger. I'm got to get away from that. But then it's gone. So burst of fear, burst of adrenaline, stop again, calm down. But now we humans can have constant chronic stress because problems that don't go away. If you worry about your job, it's not going to, there's no end point to that. You can keep your job for 20 years, but you still worry about losing it if you think, I'm not doing great, or the company could go downhill. These are all intangible problems which have no tangible end point. And therefore the stresses maintain, they persist. And we have chronic stress, which our brain and the stress system hasn't evolved to deal with. So it keeps pumping out stress chemicals that are even at a low level, but it's over time, it's enduring, it's persistent. And that means parts of the brain which react to stress are constantly doing that. And then they become overstimulated. In case of anxiety, like the fear response is too primed and the brain adapts, saying, okay, constant fear, that's what we need. Or they get exhausted. And the mood control part, the neurons just get too stimulated by too much stress. They go, all right, I've had enough. I can't do this anymore. They just shut down. And that's why you get locked in this mood state, this low mood, and you can't get out of it because the part of your brain which does that is just spent. It's alive. It's not dead. It's still functioning, but it's on standby. It's no, I got nothing else to give. And that seems to be why depression is such a common thing. It's the part of the brain which normally deals with this sort of stuff being too taxed, too overwhelmed, or just too much demand put on it, because the modern world is so complex and so chaotic and so intangible and so unpredictable. All these things lead to something which can end up in a depressive state.
Thank you for breaking that down that way. Two questions then for me that come up in that. The first one is about different terms for depression, because there's a difference when we lose someone we love and we're depressed, and then there's a difference if it's a chronic depression because of this stress that never relents. So that's the first question, something about that, different ways of speaking or understanding depression. The other question, what do we do about it?
Well, I'll tackle the first question first because that's sensible. So again, it's a refrain I've made many times now, but I still stand by it, and that in the wider world, we would ideally have different words for for want of a better term, everyday depression or common depression, or the depression you experience when you lose someone, or when a relationship fails, or when you lose a job, or when just you have a bad day. We say sadness, we say low mood, but you can say, I'm depressed because it could be because your football team lost again, or it could be because your diet's not going great. These are, to say you're depressed about that is a valid sentence. You can say, I'm depressed because me and my wife aren't getting on, or that's perfectly fine. That's everyday English. You can say that.
Yeah.
Then you can say, I'm depressed because the psychiatrist says I meet all the criteria for clinical depression. And it's the same word, which means two very different things. And part of the stigma, I think, comes from people thinking, oh, you say you're depressed. Well, I've been depressed because me and my girlfriend broke up that time.
Yeah.
You were sad, you were unhappy, you weren't clinically depressed. That's a whole different thing. Tantamount to say, like, go to someone like who's lost a leg saying, well, I had a paper cut once, so you should cheer up. And that's like, no, that's not quite the same thing. Yes, you were injured. I'm not saying it was you enjoyed it, but different level. It's
not the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on that point too, I mean, I certainly recognize I haven't had everyone's experience. There's a lot in life I don't understand. But having myself, at least at one point in my life, been in a place where I couldn't get out of bed. There was nothing physically wrong with me, but it was like I couldn't find, even to say I couldn't find the motivation, that's not quite right. Like, or to say the will, like I didn't know how. Like, I'm like, what is going on with me? I mean, I wasn't paralyzed. It wasn't like some, I knew that I could move if I wanted to, but I couldn't find it within me to shave, to dress, to do anything. And it's like, that's a very different experience from, oh, my team lost the Super Bowl.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, I think it comes to the fact of people don't really think of that as a thing. Is it like I was depressed? Like I had a girlfriend break up with me, and I spent like a good couple of evenings just lying on my bed going, what's the point of anything? But I could get up, just like I didn't feel like it. I didn't want to. I didn't see any point. But it wasn't. I didn't feel debilitated. I was just in that low mood state of like, well, why bother? What's the point? No one's gonna love you. You're worthless. But this is a fleeting thing.
And I realize too, this is where I know this could get really philosophical, but I think there's an aspect of this as well that is very existential.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right? Why do I exist? What's the point of anything? Like all these kinds of things that are pretty different from people who either don't, for whatever reason, seem to ask those kinds of questions, or they seem to have asked those questions and they found an answer that's working for them. So they don't relate to that experience also from that perspective of somebody, asking a question that they haven't ever thought to ask, or, looking at the world in a way that never occurred to them. Someone once, and maybe described depression as being like a black dog.
Yeah, that's a very well-known comparison. It's true. It just hounds you. It just follows you around. But it's not like a wolf. It's not energetic. It's not like chasing you. It's just there.
Yeah.
Constantly, like, quote unquote, dogging your every move, like sapping your energy. Just won't leave you alone. It's just there. Like it's a presence. It's a weight. Yeah.
That's right.
I think Rodney Dangerfield called it the heaviness. Like, I got the heaviness, and but he was a comedian, but he was a very troubled man, and but he was open about it, and that's long before that was the norm. So people like that were kind of trailblazers in a way. Like, I'm a big fan of Spike Milligan, the Irish comedian, UK comedian. He's a very big influence on Monty Python. Like, he's one of the originators. But I've got his war diaries, and he was in World War II. He's on the front lines as part of the Sigmund Corps, and he was a ridiculous man. Like, they had loads of fun and like Monty Python-esque stuff, and before that was a thing. But he got hit by a mortar shell, not face on because he survived, but he went to a camp full of casualties, as they called them. They were all bomb happy. That's what they called it. When you experienced so much trauma in the front line, you couldn't function anymore. You weren't physically injured, but you were mentally completely incapable of doing anything. And so it was definitely a thing then. People always say like, oh, the greatest generation, they had none of this. Oh, they did. They absolutely had it, but they couldn't talk about it, or they couldn't acknowledge it. And Lord knows what damage that did to them in the long run. It was. I don't think that's a healthy approach at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, so these things are real. These things are very, very... the human mind is an incredible thing, but it's not perfect. It's not invulnerable.
Yeah.
And the idea that it is is an everyday fantasy, which is something we should really be dispelled as soon as possible.
To me, there's a very interesting view about stress is a cause, or at least a huge contributor to the massive incidence of depression in our world today. And whether or not anyone listening accepts that, I suspect many people listening have in fact had the experience of a depression of the second type, the one that is a black dog type of depression.
Absolutely.
And so this, for anyone in that situation, or maybe even for someone in that situation, or for someone who's not in that situation, but is related to or intimately connected with someone who is, which I know is its own whole thing, right? Because like we have Alcoholics Anonymous, and then there's Al-Anon, for the families and so forth. The depression is the same thing, where it can be very difficult. It's the same in that it's one thing to live with it yourself. It's another to live with someone who lives with it. So the question of where I'm going then is whether someone finds themselves in the situation or being in close relationship with someone who is, what do they do about it?
Yeah, this is what I totally get why people are interested in that, and I am too, but I sort of hesitate to say do this, do that, because again, back to the very first thing we said, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not legally qualified to say you must do this, because that's that's beyond my pay grade and outside of my realm of experience, and I would never say any different. I'm also slightly opposed, not too strong a word, but I'm always very sort of about the whole self-help thing, in that I get why it appeals to people, and I get why people might find it really helpful, like reading a self-help book to say, do this, do that, you will feel better if you do this or that. But people who make self-help books or write them, to me, what they're saying is, I don't know you, I don't know what's going on in your life, but I can fix you if you just give me some money and do what I tell you. So I'm very wary of that sort of attitude and that sort of approach to things. So with those caveats in mind, it's also important to recognise that individual variation will be so considerable in anything to do with mental health. Like your problems stem from what you've gone through, and I personally don't know what that is. I don't mean you. I mean anyone listening to this.
Sure.
But also you, because obviously it applies to everyone. So I don't know what you've gone through, and I think I should try to point this out. Yes, I know I present myself as I'm the brain guy. I can explain how mental health problems occur in the brain and stuff. But if you have experienced a mental health problem and gone through the system and dealt with it like that, you are in many ways more of an expert than I am, because I haven't done that yet. Could happen, could easily happen, could well have happened this year, but so far it hasn't. So I want to put the caveat then, you know your mind better than I do, and that's a big part of mental health interventions, and that you should have the individual saying, what is going on? You tell me, because the only way you can know what's going on in someone's mind is when they tell you. We have no means of looking into it yet. You can put them in a brain scanner and see, there's more stuff going on here than there, but that's a very crude assessment of what's going on. It just gives you some sort of signpost. It doesn't tell you anything particularly revealing. Yeah. But I think personally, and it sort of underlies why I do a lot of what I do, I think that knowing that there's something amiss in your head is can be a big help. So when you feel like you're depressed and stuff, it can be so overwhelming. It can be so challenging. Like you think, God, I'm worthless. I feel bad. But if you can spare the mental resources or the mental energy, or for someone you're dealing with, to say there's nothing. They're not at fault here. It's not their fault that this is happening. It's like something's going on upstairs which shouldn't be happening, and you can point and say, because the stress response has caused this and stuff. So being able to say, this is happening because A happened, which led to B, which led to C, which led to D, and here we are. I think being able to ground a mental health problem in real world concepts and real world processes can be a really big help. And perhaps, it's not the be all and end all. It won't fix things necessarily, but knowing that there is something amiss here, and it's not my fault. It's not like I'm not a flawed person. I'm not a damaged human. It's just like, this is a thing that's happened to me, and I need to deal with it. Like if someone gets a cold, you don't think you are a failure for getting a cold.
Right.
Well, some people might think that, but ignore them. Or something. And back to the physical thing, I know, but it's the same process. And if you've developed depression, it doesn't mean you're a failed human. It doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It's just that stuff has happened to you, mostly beyond your control, I bet, as well. Like, or you've made decisions perhaps which led to this, but you didn't know that. That wasn't your decision. This is whole thing about responsibility, like particularly with addiction. That's where you should know better comes into it. But no one who tries drugs plans on being an addict any more than anyone who goes skiing plans on breaking a leg. It's not something anyone plans or wants to happen. So I think taking the idea that there's something wrong with you as a person. Obviously, there is something amiss if you have a disorder. Obviously, there's something which needs to be addressed and needs to be dealt with. But it's not. It doesn't mean you're a bad person or a failed person. It's like you have this affliction which you need to recognize it as such. To say because it's happening within your mind, it's a lot harder to separate from you and your problem. And that's why we say people with depression rather than depressives now, or people with addiction or addicts, and that's a whole other issue on that loaded term. So, again, without knowing your full situation, listener, I would not presume to say, here's how you fix what's going on with you. But I think maintaining awareness or acknowledging that, yeah, there's a problem here, but it's unlikely to be anyone's fault. And even if it was one specific person who made decisions or committed actions which led to this point, this was never their intention. Because I think I would stake money on that. No one ever plans to be depressed. No one ever wants to cause depression. So I think absolving this idea of personal failure or personal responsibility or flawed individuals from the equation can be a big help. And I would hope that would be something I have been trying to achieve in my works and stuff. But just taking that in mind of, yes, brains go wrong sometimes, minds go wrong, just because that's how they work. They are extremely complex, but also vulnerable. And also, they react to things in the world, and the world is not always a friendly, forgiving place. And that's something which really should be kept at the forefront of anyone's mind. Yeah.
In fact, I think it's probably true the world is not often a friendly or forgiving place.
Trying to sort of be a bit more optimistic, but yes, it's definitely it's a challenging one, especially lately.
Yeah. And to me, it's such an interesting inquiry between what we ultimately do have control over or responsibility for and where that line ends and so forth. But I don't think we'll wander too far into that to that question.
Yeah, that's a whole other thorny issue. Yeah,
yeah, and then we could go from there to the issue of free will and all kinds of things, existence and so forth. We won't follow that path today, but I am curious about, and I appreciate your response there. It seems very compassionate to me, and I personally admire. I'm the authority that you're not saying I'm the authority. Here's what you should do. If it doesn't work for you, you're clearly defective. This kind of thing.
That's why I sort of worry about the whole self-help thing, because you have one book which says, here's how you fix your problems. And for a lot of people that will work. And let's not deny it. Even just the act of having the decision taken out of your hands and given to someone else, that can be a very reassuring thing. Sure. Cool, it's not up to me now, it's up to this person.
Yeah.
But it won't work for everyone.
So this issue then, this for me follows from this about, okay, what do we do? Well, we honor, what is, and we treat ourselves with compassion, that's how I would say, and so forth, and recognizing we're all unique and our situation is what it is. And at some level, that's a little bit challenging, I think, because it's going, well, shoot, there wasn't an easy answer. There wasn't, a website to visit or a prescription to start taking or whatever. We all got to find our way through, forward in life. But you mentioned this thing in the book about self-medicating, saying we all self-medicate. If you take paracetamol for a headache or over-the-counter remedies for a cold, or even try mint tea for an upset stomach, you're self-medicating. You're addressing your own health issues without medical supervision. For minor or fleeting problems, this is usually fine, but when it's a serious and chronic mental health problem, it often backfires. Will you talk a little bit more about self-medicating?
Yeah, it's a extremely natural process. I mean, even animals do it. You find like when dogs eat grass and stuff, or you find chickens eating stones. It's not because they have a digestive problem to think there's some sort of hardwired spark in the brain going, "Oh, this is a bad thing. That you need to eat stones now." And okay, so it sort of breaks up the digestive system in chickens and stuff. I mean, I don't want to go into the mental health problems of chickens, because that's a whole other problem. They keep crossing roads, nobody knows why. But yeah, so okay, we have agency. We are in control of our lives to a strong degree, and we have the ability to think, well, I feel bad about this certain thing, what would make me feel better? And we do that a lot. I mean, arguably mindfulness is a big part of that. This whole thing of the mindfulness boom in the marketplace. That if you feel a bit sort of stressed or wrung out, or you can buy a mindfulness colouring book or download a mindfulness app. And although you're not actually ingesting anything chemical, that arguably is self-medication. Because you think, well, I have a problem, I want to do something about it. Here's what I'm going to do. No one's told you to. No one doctor has said, you must do this now. It's your choice to do that. Because people want to feel better when things go wrong. And okay, why wouldn't they? That's what more autonomy could you possibly ask of someone? But yeah, when it's a sort of minor problem, or when it's like an everyday thing, that's not necessarily a big deal. That's okay. As in, we should be able to sort out our own issues and stuff. Like if you haven't, like I had a achy ankle the other day, so my shoes were kind of worn out, so I bought an ankle brace, and it fixed it. Now we bought some better shoes. So no, I didn't see a physiotherapist. I didn't see a sort of an osteopath or anything. I just said, my ankle's giving me jip. I'm going to bind it up a bit and then walk on that. Now I feel better. I can go into town and replace my shoes. No experts were involved. I don't know anything about bones really. I know they're there. I know they're important, but so like I self-medicated, and that's how people do. That's how you operate. But I with regards to my ankle, it was a localized thing. So this ankle is sore. I know that if you sort of tighten it up and sort of restrict it, then you can feel better. So I'll do that. But if I was like an everyday person, say if I was someone who just worked in a bakery or whatever, and then I suddenly started having a psychotic episode, what do you do about that? What is the option there? What's the go-to fix for a psychotic episode? There isn't one. We don't know. We don't talk about it enough. Perhaps. I mean, if psychosis isn't even like an uncommon thing, it manifests in so many problems. Like it can be caused by organic issues and other disruptions to the body. Which that's why the doctors who notice psychosis have to rule out so many things to say where it's coming from. It could be caused by something else entirely, caused by the problem that you're dealing with. And organic ones too, like not just dementia and stuff, but like pneumonia can lead to a psychotic episode because of the various ways the body's intertwined. But whether or not it should be, you can argue what should be the case or not. But a psychotic episode isn't something people have a go-to way to resolve. So, or like anxiety, you don't necessarily know you have anxiety. It's a slow, gradual thing. So maybe you drink more, maybe you smoke more, or maybe sort of go out more, or just indulge in some sort of comfort-eating thing. These are ways of self-medicating, but they are short-term things. They lead to more long-term problems. There's something called the stress cycle in psychiatry, whereby, so if you're having a lot of stress at work, for example, because your job's too demanding, your boss is unsympathetic and putting too much pressure on you, that's bad. It causes you stress. And obviously you don't want to be stressed, so to relax, you engage in comfort foods, like high-carb things cause a pleasure response in the brain and make you less stressed, or like you drink more, because obviously alcohol suppresses that whole thing. But then your health declines, because you're doing that all the time. You're eating too much, you're drinking too much, you gain weight in some way, you become less physically fit as well, so you're doing the same stressful job with, decline in health, and that causes more stress, because it's harder work to do, and then you eat and drink more to try and take the edge off that, and the stress cycle, it becomes self-sustaining, self-propagating, self-fulfilling. And that's because we're trying to medicate against a problem which, the medication we're choosing, for want of a better term, medication and choosing, isn't a helpful one. Like, I think like House MD was a big show for a while, wasn't it? Like the most popular one with Hugh Laurie, and he was every episode the same. Like, we've got this weird problem. Let's try this therapy. Nope. Let's try this one. Nope. Let's try this one. Nope. And that one works. I think that was pretty much every episode. But that's sort of like, when you have a medical context, you can say that. This one isn't working. Let's try something else. This one. But when you're doing it yourself, you don't know it's not working. You don't know, because it's gradual. It's your own inner workings you're trying to deal with, and it's really hard to do that when those inner workings are what's going wrong, which make you want to do this in the first place. So, insight and capacity is a big deal when you're self-medicating for mental health problems, and a lot of people don't have the relevant training or expertise to do it. Nor should they. It's not part of the curriculum. It's not part of everyday life, not part of everyday learning. But they try, and that way That's why a great deal of addiction and addicts come from pre-existing mental health conditions. Like 1 in 4 will overindulge in drugs or alcohol because they have this existing problem that they want to feel better about, and they don't have the capacity to know exactly how to deal with it, all the qualifications, or like the access to antidepressants. And there's the stigma as well, that you can't tell someone, I think I might be depressed, what do I do, a lot of the time, because people go, oh, you just snap out of it, cheer up, like then you feel worse, and then etc., etc., etc. So yeah, the self-medication thing becomes a big problem when it's done with issues and problems which people aren't equipped to handle by themselves. And nor should they be. They're very complex and very, still quite poorly understood, but even by the relevant experts.
And sometimes I wonder how much of this, the challenge that we have in understanding or successfully addressing the mental health challenges we face is related to our worldview. And I say that partly because one of my guests he's also a psychiatrist. He's a lot of things. He's a Native American, part Native American, and he brought to my awareness that whenever a Native American, like traditionally, and this is a generalization, I suppose, but when someone with a mental health challenge or a life challenge comes to an elder, a very, very common question that the elder will begin inquiring about is the set of relationships in that person's life. And I wonder how much of our challenges are like either created or compounded by the fact that we try to treat individuals in isolation to many degrees. And I know you talk about the biopsychosocial, which I thought was cool. I actually wasn't familiar with that. And maybe that's the kind of the equivalent, the Western equivalent. But this whole thing, and I know I love this saying that all advice is autobiographical. So kind of like you've said, what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. But for me, this is a big part of what has helped me to be, I think, healthy or functioning, is to look very much at my relationships and my structure and routines and my environments and this kind of thing. But at the outset, it wasn't that. It was, I think, self-medicating with a lot of things that really weren't healthy. So anyway, what do you think?
Yeah, exactly. The biopsychosocial model, which was introduced like in the 70s originally, but it's become more the default norm now. In that's when psychiatry as a discipline sort of recognized that when you have a mental health problem, there is very rarely one root cause. You can have some conditions, like I mentioned in the book, like Parkinson's or Huntington's disease, which have a specific neurological defect or an issue which is causing this problem. And you can have PTSD, like there's one particular incident which caused this outcome. Is one major trauma in their life which all things stem from. So you can have you can isolate it in many cases, but by and large, it's a combination of things. So if someone has like a genetic predisposition to depression, that's not necessarily great, obviously, but it could be fine if they have a healthy life structure around them, if they have healthy relationships, like they have a good relationship with their parents, their spouse, their children, and so on. And that's something which psychiatrists do have to deal with. I mean, I've had this very recently, in that, I say, when I went through losing my father and everything, I was cut off from my wider family because of the lockdown, because of the pandemic and everything like that, apart from online on the phone, which doesn't, that's a whole other thing, whether that's the same. But I had my wife and my 2 small children around me, and they were an absolute godsend. I would not have made it through this without them, and I will never deny such a thing. I mean, I think in my current book I'm writing about, I tried to hide my emotions from them, because I thought, even though they know what I'm going through, they know what's happened, but my wife's obviously dealing with 2 children in the middle of a lockdown, and she has her own work, which has been compromised too, and I've got a husband who's just been hit really hard by grief in the worst possible way. So I didn't want to burden her any more than she was already dealing with. My children are 8 and 5. Like I said, they just their world's completely been pulled out from under them. They've lost their grandfather. They can't see their friends, can't go to their school. Their routine is completely shot. As a parent, I didn't think. I mean, the idea of putting my grief on top of them as well was horrific. I didn't want to sort of do that to them. Like, what sort of parent would do that? So I thought I'd try to hide my grief from my family. And it turns out that was a complete waste of time, because they figured out anyway. Like, I was like you can't really, something like that, you can't hide it. But they figured out when I was in a down mood and stuff. My wife gave me some time away from the kids, or I could just to be, just to come round a bit. And my 8-year-old son was just considerate and trying to be friendly with me. And my daughter was very, she's a very forthright young child, and her response was usually look at me and go, "Daddy," and she goes, "Be happy," and just yell at me and then give me a big thumbs up. Which the fact that it made me laugh hysterically every time was probably wasn't the best precedent to set. So like I was in a seriously, my mental well-being was seriously compromised, but my relationships were keeping me afloat. And there'll be plenty of people who are in a similar situation, or other way around, people who have sort of a minor mental health concern, which is made dramatically worse by having unhealthy relationships with their spouse, partner, parents, children, whoever it is. Toxic relationships are a real big thing. So you sort of have to take into account all these things. I think what biologically could be the issue here. If there's no biological problem, what's the psychological thing? Is it that they're thinking about it in an unhelpful manner, which is where cognitive behavioural therapy comes in, to coach people to do thinking in different ways, which it doesn't lead to such negative outcomes. And then if those two things aren't necessarily the problem, what's the social context? Are they in a high crime environment? Are they impoverished? Are they in a sort of really stressful work situation? Is their family life disruptive, toxic, or just unhealthy? Or do they have nobody? Do they have no support network? Which is awful in its own right. But if you already have some minor issue, having no one to talk to or turn to would exacerbate it further. So the biopsychosocial model tries to take into account all those things. But I think the problem with it is you can sort of, in many cases, it can become a bit like, well, everyone's a winner. Like you say, you have to take everything into account, then nothing becomes a priority, and therefore you say maybe it is a biological problem, but you focus on the other things so it doesn't get addressed as much as it should. And it's also like you have to take into account the context of the people who are the medical professionals, the therapeutic people, the mental health experts. How much influence do they have? You can say to someone, okay, your neurotransmitters are low, I can give you this medication. Your psychological makeup is not helpful, so I can give you this therapy with this counsellor who will teach you to do it in a different way. Mm-hmm. But if your job's the problem, what can a doctor do about that? They don't have the ability to go to your boss and say, stop treating this person like crap. You cause them stress. Yeah. They have no ability to do that, so they've got to focus on what they can control. Yeah. But it becomes like, yes, you can acknowledge the wider situation all you want, but if they are living alone, if they're unlucky in love, again, therapists can't do anything with that unless you can say like you have counselling and become more confident, and then you manifest that way. But that's a long-term solution. If someone's in the grips of a serious mental health problem, then they don't have the time or maybe the capacity to deal with that in any practical way right now. So they need more immediate help.
Well, Dean, I know we've covered so much, and I'm grateful to you for writing this, sharing it broadly, exploring it with me today. I do want to ask if there's anything that you included in the book that I haven't, or even anything that's not in the book that you think would be of benefit to the listener. Anything I haven't thought to ask, anything like that?
I guess one thing I did stress is that even when you look at the mental health experts, like the scientific and medical understanding of mental health, there will still be cultural effects or cultural artifacts in there which change how things are seen. I think I mentioned it that I think a lot of people are familiar with the term nymphomania, but satyritis is not a common term. Have you ever heard it? Or?
I only in your book. Well, exactly. I wouldn't know it if it weren't for that.
Satyritis is the male equivalent. Nymphomania is a woman who has abnormally high sexual tendencies or sexual behaviour. Satyritis was when a man has it. And nymphs and satyrs are like mythological creatures with a association with high sex drives and things like that. But the fact is, it only became the female one became common knowledge. The male one wasn't, and that's quite telling. It's in the idea of a woman who wants lots of sex. It was seen as so wildly abnormal. Like, she's a nymphomaniac. Can you imagine? My good lord, a nymphomaniac. Whereas a man who wants a lot of sex, that's not weird. That's Tuesday, and that's it's not a thing we have these preconceptions of how the two sexes operate, which aren't accurate. A lot of women are very high sex drives, a lot of men are very low sex drives. It's perfectly normal to have that. And even but again, even something like the DSM, the Diagnostics and Manual, which defines psychiatric disorders in most of the Western world. It's a very thorough, very good, and very useful document, but it's also the product of the American Psychiatric Association, which has obviously an American basis. It's basically like, this is how mental health works in the context of American culture. So will the criteria for depression here, will they apply equally to someone in the rural areas of Ghana who has a similar condition? They probably wouldn't, not so much. And although they are quite generic and they are quite generalized, it's not like it's nothing so specific like if you don't live in New York you must be depressed. There's nothing like that. It's just, but it's even the experts themselves. They exist in a society, in a culture, which will have its own impact and influence on what they do, think, and believe. And that's, like we said, the whole homosexuality was an official mental disorder 5 decades ago, and because the rest of the world that the experts lived in thought that was the case. And so, that's, we've moved on a lot since then, but we are still creatures of our culture, creatures of our upbringing, and our understanding of mental health, both problems and just general functioning, will be heavily influenced by that. And it's kind of important to keep that in context as well if you want to explore it further.
I do have one question for an enlightening lightning round. As I mentioned, we did that last time we interviewed, so I won't recreate the entire list. But
if you want, let's go.
One question in particular is from the enlightening lightning round is this: what important truth do you believe that very few people agree with you on?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think this is going to sound perhaps weird, but I think everyone is wrong, and
that doesn't sound weird.
But I think everyone should appreciate that they're wrong. The beliefs you have, there's no such thing as a purely objective person. Like you said, all therapy is autobiographical. The way our brains work, we only have our own experience to go on. Even if we absorb all the random facts on the completely raw data that we can, our brains don't work like that. We emphasize our own experiences, the emotions we had in lieu of those experiences, our own memories, and they're all taken from an egocentric perspective. So even the things you think are completely, utterly logically sound, of course this is the truth, how could it not be? There will be plenty of those things in your own head which are also, by anyone else's standards, wrong, or by purely objective measures, they are incorrect. And that's just how it is. We can't get around that because the brain isn't a computer. It's not a perfect logic engine. So I guess, thanks to social media, thanks to Twitter, it's far more common for people to say, this is how it is. And, anyone who disagrees with me is clearly an idiot.
Yeah.
That's almost never the case. Even if you think you've thought about it thoroughly and completely and wholeheartedly, and you've arrived at the only possible conclusion, the world isn't that straightforward. And humans especially aren't that straightforward. We can and will still make mistakes in our chain of thought and our logic. So I guess the truth is that nobody is completely right about everything. People are far more complex than we are willing to give them credit for. And the current trend towards tribalism and sound bites and easy answers is just it's almost like a comfort blanket to protect us against the reality. And that is something which hopefully over time will become more and more apparent. So I guess my truth is everyone's wrong about something, and that which of course everyone will deny because that's exactly the point.
Yeah. All right. As a thank you to you for making time to share what your experience, and insight with me, I've gone on Kiva.org again, and I've made another $100 microloan to an entrepreneur named Ilda in Mozambique, who's 42 years old. She has 7 kids. And she's going to use this money to buy supplies for her farming. She plants corn and cabbages and peppers. Amazing. And she even rents a tractor. So this is the 14th time she's borrowed from Kiva. I won't make any interest off this. It'll go to fund the operations there. So
amazing. Oh, that's really nice, man. That's really good. Well, thank you, and thank Kiva, of course. That's really quite helpful.
They're doing some good work.
Yeah. Put some good in the world. That's all you can really ask for, really, is it? think the world's a slightly
for
better
sure.
place because he did that, and you can't ask for more.
Well, Dean, if you're okay with that, I would like to just end with a couple questions about writing and creativity.
Yes,
if that
please
works.
do. With a caveat that I'm a non-fiction writer, so people like creativity.
Okay. Well, we'll say the writing process, perhaps.
Yes, of course, yeah.
And again, if anyone wants, they can go listen to our original interview. You provided a number of answers to some of the strategies and tactics you use to get your books and articles written. For this interview, I just want to ask, how has your writing changed? Not your writing itself, but your writing process. How has it changed over time? And what do you find is working for you now?
It has changed drastically. You're right there. Because my first book, The Idiot Brain, still my most successful one, but also it's the oldest, so it's had more time for people to buy it. That was a very quick turnaround time. I wrote that in, I'm going to say 8 months, maybe 10 if you count like start to finish properly. But that's because I was relaxed about it then. As in that I didn't think anyone would want to read it. Well, not nobody, but I didn't think it would be a success or anything because I thought, well, it's my one chance to write a book. I'll just say the stuff I've also wanted to say about the brain here, put it out. It's all stuff I had rattling around in my head. And then I wrote it, and I thought, look, this is all stuff I wanted to say. Here it is in some sort of digestible format. Give it to my publishers. Do what you want with that. And it went really well, like much better than anyone expected. And that was like almost, there was a double-edged sword. Like it was great. I'm a writer now. That's what I do. I'm an author. But also like, I can't do that again because like that everything I wanted to say was in that one book, and now I have to think of new stuff.
Yeah, it's very common, by the way, in musicians, right?
Oh,
like almost
yeah.
always, the sophomore album is not quite what that first album was.
Well, I think it's a thing is that of course, musicians like I don't think there's ever been a musician who's just, unless you count the manufactured bands who are actually former models which have been put together by corporations. But I mean, actual bands, they tout their ways for years to try to make it big, and then they finally hit. But that first album is like the end result of many years of striving, of working hard to. This is like the pearl amidst all the grit which got to this point, which is like filtered and refined, and then that goes out. That's a big hit, and then what's the next album? We need it next year. Like okay, like that. Yeah. It's a whole different process, and. Yeah, so like my first book and my second book, The Happy Brain, are very different beasts. And that the second book is more of a traditional science book in that it's a narrative. It's me going on a journey, making an investigation, exploring and talking to people. Because the publishers wanted something, said, can you do a more normal science book? Because I'll have a go. And I did, and it went fine. Like, but I still think my tendency towards easily digestible chunks. I came into writing as a blogger, and I think when I revert to writing like short, not short, like sort of a couple of thousand words about a certain subject, and then move on to the next one, that's when I flourish, because that's how my brain sort of adapted. Like that's how I learned to write, doing that. So I'm still in it's sort of my comfort zone, but I wouldn't like necessarily call it that, because I do think I explore different areas, but it's like that's the format I revert to. Actually, I have a friend of mine, Aaron Gillies, he wrote a book called How to Survive the End of the World, brackets, when it's all in your head, about him living with chronic anxiety. But he made his name on Twitter, so most of his book it's good, it's very good, but it's also like every other sentence has like a one-line joke, because that's how he made his name. Like he's a Twitter guy, so like bang, 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 punchy one-lines. And I do think it's important to go beyond your comfort zone, because like when I did The Happy Brain, I was doing I was trying to be like other science writers, more normal science writers, and I think it worked. I'm very proud of the book. I think it's good, but it's also like it's not quite me. So for this latest one, psychological is back to more of the easily readable chunks format, in that even though one chapter is about depression, one's about anxiety, it's like the basics of depression. It's the underlying neuroscience. What's with the monoamine hypothesis? What's with the neuroplasticity hypothesis? So I break it down into chunks and so on. So I'm still doing that, and I think that works for me. And I could sort of change it. I could do something differently, but it's at this point like to what end? Like I can still do a book. I could do I've never done a fiction book. I have no real plans to, because I'm the sort of guy, I can have an idea for a story, but then I'd sort of get completely lost in the realms of my fine details. Like, this is how the brain worked in this situation. I just 53 pages of neurological stuff before the two characters have their first kiss and stuff. Like, it's not really. That's almost like American Psycho level pedantry, isn't it? But this emotional book I'm writing has been a far more difficult process. But in a way, I'm sort of glad about now, because I thought it would just mean do another sort of, I'll do 7 chapters about the different emotions, about fear, about anger, about happiness and stuff, and then the brain bits which involved, a few funny examples of how they work, and then bang, bang, jobs are good, and I'll send it in. But then to find out that I didn't know that, and that nobody knows that, and to have to deal with that as a process to say, oh, cool, I don't know this, and I'm having to research this on the fly, and to say, this is what happens here. And several chapters I've laid out to think I'm going to do this. And then I found a certain paper and I found a certain study or a certain school of thought. I think, oh, that's actually much better. I'm going to sort of rejig this whole section. So this is the thrust of it. And then shunt this stuff to a later section. So I think it's really helped to have a combination of, this is how I like to write, but I'm writing about something I don't really know about, so I'm going to have to improvise and ad-lib. So to have this sort of nice combination of structure and creativity to say, right, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to get to this point. I guess maybe it's the difference between strategy and tactics, and this is my strategy and this is how I'm going to get there. So I have a set strategies, I need to get to this point, but my tactics will change based on what I find. So yeah, I'm quite liking this book in that it's a whole different journey again. I've got an end point in mind. I know what I want to say. I've got an overall framework, but as I'm writing it, it's becoming more and more interesting. This is a thing. Oh, I didn't know that, and now I'm going to bring that in. I'm going to rejig that. Actually, I'll go back to the first chapter and say this now. And yeah. So to have some flexibility, to have some plasticity about how your book's going to work, I'm finding that a really rewarding process.
That's cool for me to hear you talk about it. It's similar for me to something another one of my previous guests, Mark Nepo, talks about. He says that, he points out that common writing advice is to write what you know, but for him, he says he writes what he needs to know. And in that way, each of his books become his teachers.
Oh, yeah.
That is an interesting
Absolutely.
view.
Yeah, that's me particularly, because I like to, my default assumption whenever I write anything is to assume that the reader is at least as smart as I am in terms of intellectual abilities, but just doesn't know what I know. So they can understand this stuff, but they don't have my grasp of jargon and terminology. So I got to say it in ways which, you're a smart person, you grasp this, but I can't use terms you won't have heard before. And that's really helpful to me. That's a really good, when it comes to writing scientific non-fiction, I think that's a really good rule of thumb anyway, in that don't assume, like a lot of scientific books are, I think, quite preachy, quite lectury in, hello, mere mortal, let me impart to you the secrets of the universe. You stand back, and if you can't handle it, then get out of the kitchen. All right, mate, calm down. That's not really any need for that. And so, yeah, I'm far more a case of, I think it comes from coming at it from a comedy background too. I did a lot of stand-up comedy before I was a writer and during, in that when you step on stage as a stand-up comedian, you have an audience in front of you, and you cannot be posturing at them. You cannot be arrogant. You cannot condescend to them. You can't say, I'm going to tell you people some things you don't know because you're small and dim, and because that really doesn't work in a comedy audience. You have to get them on side and make them like you and relate to you as soon as possible, with as few words as possible. And you can't use big terms. And I guess that's sort of become an ingrained reflex of here's my audience. I got to make them at least want to listen to me. Maybe not would laugh, but at least give me the time of day. And to do that, I got to engage with them, relate to them, connect with them in ways that they can grasp. They're not stupid. They just don't know what I know because they don't have my life. And again, that's a sort of default assumption that's never steered me wrong so far.
I like that. I like that a lot. Tell me, how do you approach, you've talked a bit in this interview about the blogging that you do and that you've done. How do you manage yourself and your time when it comes to blogging? Do you have an editorial calendar you maintain? How do you choose topics? Do you have word counts? How frequently do you write and publish? Like all this kind of thing.
Yeah, my life actually is somewhat less organised now than it used to be, because I used to have a day job where I was, well, again, ahead of the curve. I used to teach remotely. I was the head of an online psychiatry course, so online learning and sort of working from home is something I've been weirdly adept at since long before the pandemic. So in some ways I was primed for the situation. But I had a boss who was like very, very relaxed. He knew all there is to know about neuropharmacology and pretty much nothing else. So he said, as long as the work gets done, I don't care when it happens, how it happens, as long as it gets done before it's supposed to be done, just do what you want. And so that gave me a lot of free rein. So like I would go, I kept office hours, but because we had international students, some of them weren't up until like 6 in the afternoon, so I had to do stuff at night. So I was in my office, like I had time to kill. So I would blog, not so much on the fly, but when something occurred to me. That was always my strength as a blogger for like a major news network. I could come up with a blog in the morning and have it to them within like 3 or 4 hours, and it would be like research and linked and stuff, and it would meet the criteria. It wasn't just like mashing a keyboard, like all work and no play makes Dean a dull boy sort of thing. That wasn't what I was going for, but it was always my strength. And I think it's like the old comedy thing again. So if you like jokes, like if this joke doesn't work, I'll just throw another one. Like that was always my approach to blogging. Like this one, here's my blog, see how it works. Doesn't work, right? I'll do another one tomorrow. And that wasn't perhaps the best thing for quality of output in the early days, but it meant I had a lot of practice and a lot of time to refine. If you look at some of my earlier blogs from like 2012 now, they're like, oh God, really? I found in the data about which is something that became topical, and I read it. Goes, oh, I wouldn't publish this now. It's still there on the internet, anyone could read it, but like I wouldn't, as I am now, I would not write this. So I'd had like a lot of free time in work to say, I'm going to write this particular blog now. I'm going to spend some time doing this because I will catch up later. Now I'm full time, so I'm writing books most of the day, or like writing a book most of the day. And the blogging, I would like to do more of it. I feel like I should do more of it, but like I'm kind of behind the schedule of the books. And my problem now is that I got this outdoor cabin and stuff, which is great for them working at home. But I got small children, so I can't work in the house with them because they are very nice kids, but they like to see what I'm doing. They come into the room and sort of say what's up and stuff. We're a very close family, so it's nice, but also that's not conducive to a working environment. So I work out here, but even then, I'm not a morning person. I've always worked better like from say like 1 o'clock onwards. Before we had kids, I would work. I start like writing the book at 1 o'clock. I'd go through till 10. And that would be, I get loads done then.
Yeah, how many words were you able to typically write in that kind of 9-hour period? Did you ever track that?
I can,
or pages.
Oh, like I at my peak when I was like, if I hit my flow, I could do a good 1,000 words an hour quite easily.
Wow.
I was knocking out 9,000 words a day, quite no problem. That was. And then of course the next day I delete like half of those and put them back out again. But no. Word count was writer's block has never been an issue with me. It's what like writer's bilge just pours out like trying to put it in some sort of shape. So yeah, so like that was my routine, and that's how I excelled. But of course now we have children, and we have family dinner time and bath time and bedtime, which is really important, and I wouldn't give up for anything. But it does mean that I have to stop my working day at 5 and then spend several hours. Then you can't really get back into your flow then. So I've slowly but surely tried to bring myself to be more of a morning person, but it's an uphill struggle. So my writing has changed in that regard. So I'm not as productive as I once was, perhaps, because I have other responsibilities now. But with regards to the ideas and stuff, I always write better when an idea is given to me, or suggested to me at least, because I can come up with my own stuff, but I'm far more of a reactive writer than like I don't have like this big huge grand scheme in my head of like this is the book I want to write, this is my magnum opus, this is my life's work. Maybe I'll have that one day, but so far no, I'm far happier sort of responding to what people want and need from me than putting my own sort of ideas. Like even with the Guardian blog and stuff, there were a few things like, oh, this would be a great blog. And I spent like several weeks prepping it and putting it together and put it out there. And it did okay. It did decent numbers, but it was quickly forgotten. But then when the Robin Williams article, like I said, I found out he passed away at 9 a.m. I started the blog at like 10. I had it submitted by midday. He was up by like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Be read by 500,000 people 4 hours later. And so that's how I do best. Like, I'm very much an on-the-fly writer.
Yeah.
And even like I've got this other book, like Why Your Parents Are Driving Up the Wall and What to Do About It, which is doing really well. It's a book for teenagers, but explains to them why their parents are the problem ones, not the teenagers, as most books do. I mean, it's tongue-in-cheek. It also explains everything from both sides. But that was suggested to me by an editor at Penguin Books because he thought it would be a good idea and he thought I'd be the good person to write it. And I loved the idea. I said, oh yeah, I can do that. They said, well, if you're going to do it, we need it within 6 weeks. So that, okay, I guess I'll do it. And I wrote it in 6 weeks because it was stuff I already knew, but it was like, I got this idea now and I got the deadline. Right, I'll make that work. And I did. And it's fine. But this emotional book, which I've had like a year and a half to write now and I'm still not finished, I'm really proud of it. It's going well, but it's a slog in that regard. It's far more personal, it's far more intimate, it's far more detailed, it's far more intensive, it's far more philosophical. So yeah, so I have a variety of writing styles, but if you ask me what I'd like to write best as, like when it comes to blogs, I like to say, oh, this is the news. Oh, I can write about that. I'll turn it out, send it off. There's a blog. Enjoy. Or even like something which stimulates like the toxic positivity thing. Is mentioned on Twitter. Oh yeah, I meant to write something about that. Yeah, there's my blog. Enjoy it. And that's how I tend to write blogs best. Like reactive, on the fly, heat of the moment, essentially. That's what I find most stimulating. So yeah, that's sometimes like my blog output drops because I'm doing something else. But when I'm back to like I have no books to write, then the blogs become more common because I have more time to do them and more things to pay attention to.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think my final question here is just what, again, we acknowledged this earlier in the interview about how much has changed in the world in 2020 and certainly in every one of our lives. Everybody listening has had their own form of change. Not to reduce this to something simple or happy, the live, laugh, love kind of platitude, but what advice or encouragement, suggestion, invitation, whatever you would call it, you offer anybody listening, and maybe particularly, I mean, this could be related to writing, this could be related to life, just maybe a final thought. What do you want to leave the listener with?
I think it comes down to all those things, like with regards to writing, with regards to the current situation, with regards to the world events and stuff. It's like, if I had to sum it up, it's 4 words. You'll get through this because you will. I mean, time goes on, things change, no situation is static. And I think that's something which people don't acknowledge enough, I think. Like, people say, like, remember the good times, they'll be gone before you know it. Yeah, that's true, but the same applies to the bad times, because time is a thing. We are always moving forward, we're always progressing. Whether you like, it can be an awful time, it can be a horrific time, it can be really bad, and it will be. And you should acknowledge it as such. Don't deny it, don't sort of think, don't try and sort of ignore, suppress the problem. But time moves forward and things change because nothing is permanent, But that can be an inspirational thing, not necessarily a negative thing. Like the bad times, they have no more staying power than the good times. And that is important to appreciate, I think. So yeah, you'll get through this. You might not like it, you'll probably hate it, and that's right. And it might have lasting effects on you, but it will end. And that is, I think, a kind of often overlooked aspect of just how life works.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, thank you for that. And again, for anybody that wants to learn more from you or to connect with you, they can visit deanburnett.com.
Indeed,
right?
That's my site.
They can find your books on Amazon.com, hopefully at their local bookseller. Any other social media handles or websites that you would point people to?
Facebook is Dean Burnett Write in Person, because even though it's completely legit, I still have trouble calling myself an author. I don't know why. This sounds more pompous than I'm willing to concede to. Also on Twitter, it's Garrowboy, Garwboy, because I think I just said his last name, but the Garrow Valley in South Wales is where I was born and raised, and I picked the Twitter handle before I had any idea anyone would care who I was. So it was purely just like, oh, I'm that guy from the Garrow. Maybe I'm the first to join Twitter. I might have been. I don't know, but that's not why I'm known these days. But I've kept it anyway because nostalgia.
Right on. Well, good. Okay. Well, I've enjoyed this so much, and I'm looking forward to when this book is out, and your next one as well. And
yeah, I've got them coming. Yes, churn them out.
Thank you again.
Thanks, Burnett.
Despite living in an age where we have more comforts and conveniences than ever before, life isn't working for many people. Whether it's in the developed world, where we're dealing with depression, anxiety, addiction, divorce, jobs we hate, relationships that don't work, or people in the developing world who don't have access to clean water or sanitation or healthcare or education, or who live in conflict zones, there's a lot of people on the planet that life isn't working very well for. If you're one of those people, I invite you to connect with me at goodliving.com. I've created Life's Best Practices Breakthrough Coaching to help you navigate the transitions that we all go through. Whether you've just graduated school, you're going through a divorce, you just got married, you're headed into retirement, you're starting a business, you just lost your job, whatever it is you're facing, I've developed a 36-week course that you go through with me and a community of achievers and seekers who are committed to improving their own lives and the lives of others. So through this online program, you will have the opportunity to go deep into every area of your life, explore life's big questions, create answers for yourself in community, get clarity and accountability. If that's something you're interested to learn about, I invite you to contact me directly at brian@brianmiller.com or by visiting goodliving.com.